You never expect a quiet house in Brentwood to end in blood. Not a house like theirs. Not with names like Reiner attached to it. But that's exactly what happened. Rob Reiner, the beloved filmmaker, the voice of reason in so many political firestorms, the man who gave the world When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men, found dead beside his wife, Michelle, inside the walls of their $13.5 million estate. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Stab wounds. No sign of forced entry. No suspects fleeing into the night. Just their son, Nick, arrested hours later. Now, here's the part no one saw coming. Willie Nelson. At 92 years old, the country music icon, the quiet observer of generations, the man who has known presidents, outlaws, and Hollywood kings, finally broke his silence. And what he said about Rob Reiner wasn't a eulogy, wasn't a defense. It was a warning. He wasn't the man you think he was. And just like that, everything cracked. Because this wasn't just a murder. This was a rupture in a carefully built narrative, one that, until now, no one dared to challenge. Reiner wasn't just Hollywood royalty. He was untouchable. The kind of man people didn't speak about, not critically, not publicly. But why now? Why Willie? And why are people suddenly digging into decades of silence? That's the question. And before we answer it, we have to ask something harder. How many people saw something and stayed quiet? This isn't the story you think it is. This isn't just about a crime. It's about an image, built over 50 years and destroyed in a night. It's about who we believe and why. And it's about what happens when someone who's spent their whole life avoiding headlines, Willie Nelson, steps into the center of one. What could he possibly know? Plenty. And from the sound of it, he's been holding it in for a long time. Now, to be clear, Willie hasn't accused anyone of anything. Not outright. He hasn't made some tabloid claim or thrown fuel on the fire. That's not his style. But what he has done is change the tone of the conversation. Completely. Suddenly, people are re-watching old interviews, rereading old profiles, remembering moments that felt off. And the question hanging in the air? Not who did this, but who was Rob Reiner? Because the thing is, Reiner's public image was built on warmth, empathy, humor, a certain charm that made you believe he was exactly who he seemed to be. But if you look closer, that image was airtight, too airtight. And that's what makes it all so unsettling. Because when someone as trusted, as loved, as safe as Rob Reiner dies under violent, internal circumstances, and the only surviving son is accused of the act, it forces a shift in perception. Suddenly, the walls come down. The stories change. And people like Willie Nelson start talking. Why didn't he say something earlier? What kept him quiet for all these years? And more urgently, what exactly was he waiting for? Here's what we know. On a quiet Sunday night, police were called to the Reiner residence. The bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner were discovered, reportedly by their daughter, Romy, 27. Romy allegedly told authorities there had been a dangerous family member, that they should start there. Her brother, Nick Reiner, was arrested that same night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And suddenly, the house was silent. But not in mourning, not in grief. It was the kind of silence that signals fear, damage control, secrets breathing in the walls. Willie Nelson didn't release a statement immediately. He didn't join the chorus of tribute tweets and soft-focus Instagram memorials. He waited. Days. Then weeks. Then, finally, he spoke. Quietly. With weight. And his voice landed like thunder. Because what he said wasn't scandalous. It was worse. It was true enough to sound like something people had already suspected, but never said out loud. He wasn't the man you think he was. 7 words. That's it. But 7 words from a man like Willie Nelson can say everything. Now here's the hard part. This story will tempt you to look for a villain. A clear, clean, evil shape. But that's not what this is. If anything, it's a story about how no one is purely anything. About how charm and control often live side by side. Rob Reiner could make you laugh. He could move a room with 2 sentences. He could lift a script with a raised eyebrow. But behind the smile, behind the scenes, there may have been a weight that only a few people ever saw. A weight that grew heavier in private. That's what Willie seems to be pointing toward. Not a crime. A truth. And that truth may help explain why a family that looked picture perfect ended up like this. but it won't make it easier to hear. So let me ask you this. When someone like Willie Nelson, who's known everyone and said almost nothing, finally speaks, what should we be listening for? Is it what he says? Or what he carefully doesn't? Because he could have said anything. He could have defended Rob. He could have gone silent again. But he chose to say that. Just enough to rattle the myth. Just enough to let the past slip through the cracks. Just enough to make us wonder, what else have we gotten wrong? And what happens when the truth doesn't look like a confession, but a quiet, decades-late correction? Because make no mistake, what happens next will not be a tabloid frenzy. It'll be slower, deeper, more uncomfortable. And what it reveals about the Reiner legacy, and about who gets protected and who gets erased, may change the way we look at more than just this family. But first, we have to go back to the night everything collapsed, to the one moment that turned whispers into headlines. And it started with the wrong person answering the door. It was a Sunday night. Quiet. Normal. No sirens. No screams. Just a warm breeze rolling through Brentwood, the kind that makes the trees whisper and the air feel impossibly calm. But something wasn't right inside the Reiner estate. The lights were on. 2 cars sat in the driveway. And behind the tall hedges and carefully maintained security gates, nothing moved. When LAPD received the call just after 9:40 p.m., it wasn't from a neighbor. It wasn't even from inside the house. It came from a voice police say was shaking, but clear. Romy Reiner, 27. The daughter. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't incoherent. She was cold, focused, and what she said to the dispatcher has since been partially leaked. There's been violence in the house. 2 people are dead. And there's someone here who should be a suspect. A pause. Their family. Let that sit for a second. She wasn't reporting a break-in, or a stranger, or a vague threat. She was giving direction. And it wasn't long before police pulled up in front of one of the most recognizable addresses in the neighborhood. A sprawling 8,000 square foot estate that Rob and Michelle Reiner had lived in for nearly 20 years. What happened next would change the conversation about this family forever. According to multiple sources close to the investigation, what officers found inside was not a chaotic crime scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no smashed windows, no panicked attempts at flight, just silence. And 2 bodies. Rob Reiner, 78, stabbed multiple times, slumped against the living room wall, reportedly with his reading glasses still dangling from one hand. Michelle Reiner, 70, found in the adjacent study, also stabbed. No defensive wounds. And upstairs, the lights were off. The guest suite door was shut. Inside, 32-year-old Nick Reiner, the couple's only son, was reportedly found sitting on the bed. No visible blood. No attempt to flee. Just sitting there. Still, he was arrested without incident. Charged hours later with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But here's where things get complicated. Because this wasn't some anonymous tragedy on the outskirts of Los Angeles. This wasn't a family no one had heard of. This was Rob Reiner. A man who had spent decades shaping American culture, both behind the camera and in front of it. And yet, as officers moved through the house, documenting what they saw, questions began to form. Quiet ones. The kind that don't make the first draft of police reports. Why did the daughter arrive when she did? Why did she speak the way she spoke? And more pressingly, what did she know? Because one thing became immediately clear. This was not a random act of violence. It was close, precise, and according to at least one investigator, controlled. Now, let's take a step back. Nick Reiner wasn't some tabloid fixture. In fact, many people didn't even realize Rob had a son. That's how private his life had become. Nick had struggled with addiction in his youth, something the family never denied. In fact, he'd even co-written a film, Being Charlie, loosely based on his own rehab journey. His father had produced it. It was a public gesture. Father and son, trying to reconnect through art. But that was 8 years ago. Since then, he'd been living in the guest house. Quietly, he was seen by neighbors from time to time, running errands, walking alone. But he didn't attend events, didn't do press, didn't, by all accounts, cause trouble. So when his name appeared on the arrest report that night, it didn't just spark curiosity. It cracked something open. Because no one in Brentwood, no one in Hollywood, wanted to believe what it implied. That behind the Reiner legacy was a fracture. A deep one. A dangerous one. One that finally gave way. And then there was Romy. The daughter who found the bodies. She didn't just call the police. She named the problem. She pointed the finger, not at an outsider, not at a theory, but at her own brother. Why? What had she seen? What had she been living with? And what pushed her to finally say it out loud? The police are still building their case. Forensic analysis is ongoing. There will be court dates, press briefings, legal maneuvers. All of that's coming. But this story, this unraveling, didn't start with blood. It started with silence. Years of it. And that silence is finally breaking. Not just through court filings, but through voices like Willie Nelson's. Because what he saw in Rob, what he remembers from the years before the awards, before the activism, before the carefully edited legacy, it isn't what we've been told. And the moment he opened his mouth, the spotlight shifted. From the crime, to the man behind the curtain. And now, we're left to ask, was this a tragedy rooted in madness? Or was it something else entirely? A consequence of something long in the making? If you only knew Rob Reiner through television interviews, this story makes no sense. That's the first problem. Because the Rob Reiner people thought they knew was gentle, thoughtful, almost disarmingly reasonable. The guy who laughed easily, spoke carefully, and seemed permanently baffled by cruelty in the world. He wasn't loud. He wasn't volatile. He wasn't the kind of man you associate with fear inside a home. That's why this case hit so hard. Because the image didn't just crack. It failed. And when images fail, people start looking backward, not to rewrite history, but to see what they missed. So let's slow down for a second. Rob Reiner spent decades building trust. Not just fame. Trust. He was the filmmaker who championed decency, the activist who spoke about moral responsibility, the Hollywood figure who positioned himself as principled, measured, safe. But here's the thing about carefully constructed public personas. They don't tell you who someone is under pressure. They tell you who someone needs to be seen as. And behind the scenes, away from cameras, away from panels and applause, there were stories that never quite made it out. Nothing explosive. Nothing that would have gone viral on its own. Just discomfort, tension, a sense that the warmth didn't always travel home. People who worked with Reiner over the years describe him as intensely focused, detail-oriented, demanding, not cruel, but uncompromising. Someone who liked control. Someone who believed deeply in his own sense of right and wrong. That can look like leadership. It can also feel like suffocation, which raises an uncomfortable question. What does that kind of presence feel like to a family? Especially to a child who doesn't fit the script. Nick Reiner never fit the script. He wasn't interested in politics. He didn't thrive in the spotlight. He struggled, publicly, painfully, with addiction in his 20s. And while Rob supported him, even turning his son's recovery into a film project, that support came with expectations. Visibility, redemption, narrative. But what happens when recovery doesn't follow a clean arc? What happens when the comeback stalls? Those are the moments that don't show up in documentaries. The nights when silence stretches too long. The conversations that don't end in understanding, but in distance. Neighbors noticed it. Not arguments, but separation. Nick living in the guest house. Coming and going alone. Rarely seen with his parents in recent years. It wasn't dramatic enough to alarm anyone, but it was enough to suggest something wasn't right. And then there's Romy. By all accounts, she was closer to both parents. More aligned with their world. More present. And when she made that call to police, when she used the word dangerous, it didn't sound impulsive. It sounded practiced. As if the thought had crossed her mind before. That's the part that keeps resurfacing. Because if Rob Reiner truly was the man everyone thought he was, kind, steady, emotionally safe, then how does a family reach this point without anyone noticing?